On a Tuesday morning in April of 1970, at the Dawson County Fairgrounds in Lexington, Nebraska, Silas Thorne made a decision that most men in the crowd considered a death sentence for his bank account. The air was thick with the smell of churned earth, diesel exhaust, and the nervous sweat of farmers looking for a bargain in a world that was rapidly becoming too expensive for them to inhabit. Silas was 23 years old, with grease under his fingernails and the weight of an 80-acre family legacy resting on his shoulders, a legacy that was currently missing its most vital component, a working tractor. At the far end of the auction lot, tucked away like a shameful secret, sat a 1950 Farmall M. To the uninitiated, it looked like nothing more than a heap of oxidized iron. The original red paint had long since surrendered to a shade of mottled brown that resembled dried blood. Its rear tires were flat, the rubber cracked into 1,000 tiny canyons, and a family of starlings had made a permanent residence in the rusted air cleaner. It had been parked in 1952, the year Silas was born, and it hadn't felt the heat of combustion in nearly 20 years. The auctioneer, a man with a voice like gravel in a blender, didn't even want to waste the breath. "Folks, we are looking at the last item of the morning," he shouted, waving a dismissive hand toward the Farmall. "This here is from the old Miller estate. Been sitting in a collapsed barn for 2 decades. Probably good for a few gears if you're desperate, or maybe as a decorative piece for someone who hates their lawn. Do I hear $50 for this genuine piece of Nebraska rust?" The crowd, a sea of weathered faces and faded denim, erupted in a chorus of low chuckles. No one moved. The smart money was at the other end of the lot, where the brand new John Deere and International Harvester machines gleamed with the promise of modern hydraulics and power steering. Silas Thorne stepped forward, his voice quiet but steady. $100, he said, bidding against the silence and himself. The laughter didn't just ripple through the crowd, it roared. $100? Someone yelled from the back. "Son, you could buy a decent horse for that and have better luck plowing." The auctioneer didn't wait for a second bid. He knew there wouldn't be one. "Sold, to the young man in the thorn cap for $100. As Silas walked toward the clerk's table to hand over his last 2 $50 bills, he felt a shadow fall over him. It was Miller Vance, the owner of the Lexington John Deere dealership. Miller was a man who lived in the future, always smelling of expensive aftershave and the new rubber of machines that cost more than Silas's entire farm. He looked at Silas with a mixture of pity and professional disdain. "Silas, I knew your father, and he was a man who understood the value of $1, Miller said, his voice dripping with a patronizing warmth. "What you just did out there, that's not an investment. That's a tombstone. That tractor is 20 years of seized pistons and rotted wiring. For $100, you could have put a down payment on a real machine at my shop. Something with a warranty, something that doesn't belong in a scrapyard." Silas tucked his receipt into his pocket and looked Miller Vance in the eye. "My father also taught me that the best things in this life are often the things people are too lazy to fix," Silas replied, echoing a sentiment that had been drilled into him in a small workshop since he was 10 years old. "You see a pile of junk, Mr. Vance. I see a puzzle that just needs the right hands." Miller laughed, a big, hollow sound that drew the attention of several nearby farmers. "Listen to him. The boy thinks he's going to outsmart 2 decades of decay with a wrench and a dream. Silas, that engine hasn't turned over since Truman was in the White House. It's probably a solid block of iron by now. You'll spend $500 in parts just to find out the transmission is full of mice and rust." The surrounding men joined in, their sneers echoing the dealer's sentiment. To them, Silas Thorne was a fool, a young man throwing away his survival on a machine that had been obsolete before he could walk. They lived in an era of rapid expansion, where bigger was synonymous with better and old was just another word for useless. Silas ignored them. He walked back to the Farmall M, laying a hand on the cold, pitted metal of the hood. He could feel the grit of the prairie dust that had settled over it for 20 years. To everyone else, it was a failure of engineering. But Silas had noticed something the others had missed in their haste to mock him. When he had reached down to check the oil dipstick before the bidding began, he hadn't found the expected dry, flaky rust. Instead, the tip had been coated in a thick, dark film that smelled faintly of high-grade preservative. Someone had loved this machine once. Someone had prepared it for a long sleep, sealing the crankcase with a care that bordered on the obsessive. As the flatbed trailer Silas had borrowed from a sympathetic neighbor pulled up to the lot, he began the arduous process of winching the $100 junk tractor onto the deck. The wheels groaned, the frozen brakes screaming in protest against the movement, a sound that Miller Vance likened to a dying animal. "I'll tell you what, Silas," Miller called out as the trailer began to pull away. "When you finally realize you can't breathe life into that corpse, bring it to my scrap pile. I'll give you $20 for the iron just so I can say I helped a neighbor." Silas didn't look back. He drove out of the fairgrounds, the rusted Farmall M swaying behind his old Ford pickup, its skeletal frame silhouetted against the Nebraska horizon. The laughter of the town was still ringing in his ears, but he didn't care. He was 23 years old, he was broke, and he had just purchased a machine that everyone said was impossible to save. He didn't know it yet, but inside that seized engine block lay a secret that would redefine everything the county knew about power, longevity, and the true cost of progress. The journey back to the Thorne farm was slow. Every bump in the gravel road sent a shudder through the trailer, and Silas spent the entire drive watching the rearview mirror, making sure his investment didn't vibrate into pieces before it reached the barn. When he finally backed the trailer into the dim, cool interior of his workshop, the silence that followed was heavy. He sat in the truck for a moment, looking at the rusted beast through the rear window. He was alone now. No auctioneers, no mocking dealers, no skeptical neighbors. Just a man, a set of inherited tools, and a machine that hadn't seen the sun in 20 years. He knew the road ahead would be measured in months of midnight oil and skin-barked knuckles. He knew he'd have to find ways to make parts that no longer existed and solve problems that modern mechanics would simply solve with a credit card. But as he stepped out of the truck and picked up a wire brush to begin cleaning the first square inch of the hood, Silas Thorne felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known since his father passed away. The $100 secret was waiting, buried deep beneath layers of grease and time. The first month Silas Thorne spent with the 1950 Farmall M was defined by the smell of kerosene and the sound of his own heavy breathing in the silence of the barn. To any outside observer, the tractor was exactly what the auctioneer had called it, a boat anchor. It sat on the dirt floor, its skeletal frame illuminated by the thin Nebraska sunlight filtering through the slats of the roof, looking every bit like a corpse that had been unearthed too late. Every system on the machine had been conquered by 20 years of abandonment. The engine was seized into a solid block of iron, the pistons welded to the cylinder walls by decades of moisture and degraded oil. When Silas finally managed to pry open the transmission case, he didn't find gears that wanted to turn. He found a sprawling complex of mouse nests and a thick, corrosive sludge that had once been lubrication. The radiator leaked from 6 different places when he dared to pour water into it, and the electrical system was a nightmare of frayed wires and crumbling insulation that looked like a tangle of dead vines. Silas stood in the center of his father's workshop, surrounded by parts that hadn't moved since 1952, and felt the immense weight of the town's expectations. But it wasn't the kind of expectation that breeds success. It was the kind that waits eagerly for a crash. In the small community of Lexington, your business is never just your own. It belongs to the diner counters and the feed store aisles. Word of the Thorne boy and his $100 stupidity had spread faster than a prairie fire. Every time Silas drove his old Ford pickup into town for supplies, the conversation at the Jessup State Bank or the local cafe would stop just long enough for the whispers to begin. He'd walk past men who had known his father for 30 years, and he would hear the same refrain over and over. They said he was throwing away his survival. They said that Walter Thorne, a man who had known how to squeeze a dollar until the eagle screamed, would be spinning in his grave if he could see his son elbow deep in a pile of Miller estate junk. Miller Vance, the John Deere dealer, made sure to keep the joke alive. He would often stop his dealership truck at the edge of the Thorne property, leaning out the window with a grin that never reached his eyes. "How's the archaeology project, Silas?" Miller would call out, his voice echoing across the north field. "I've got a brand new 4440 sitting in the showroom with your name on it. Just give up on that red rust bucket, and I'll give you a trade-in value for the scrap iron." Silas would just wave a grease-stained hand and keep working, but the words stung more than he let on. He was 23 years old, and he was being treated like a fool by the very men he needed to respect. To Silas, however, the tractor wasn't a failure, it was a puzzle. He remembered his father's voice, rough as sandpaper but steady as a mountain, telling him that every broken machine was just a series of problems waiting for a solution. The first problem was the seized engine. A professional mechanic would have charged him hundreds of dollars just to disassemble the block, money Silas simply didn't have. So, he went to the library. He sat under the hum of the fluorescent lights, studying Farmall repair manuals, engineering texts, and machinist handbooks until his eyes blurred. He taught himself the delicate art of cylinder, boring, and valve seat cutting, learning how to listen to the metal the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat. The real struggle began when he realized he couldn't simply buy the parts he needed. The 1950 Formel M was an aging model, and in the 1970 market, parts were already becoming a luxury for a young man with 80 acres and a mounting pile of debt. When he found that the original pistons were beyond salvation, he didn't call the dealership. Instead, he mail-ordered oversized blanks from a supplier in Ohio and spent 3 months in his workshop, hand-fitting them to the block with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. He became a scavenger of his own heritage. He salvaged gears from broken machinery tucked away in the back of neighbors' barns, and when a tool didn't exist for a specific task, he built it himself. He fabricated a custom boring bar from scrap steel and an old electric motor, a piece of industrial archaeology that looked like something from a much simpler age. He spent hundreds of hours grinding and fitting and adjusting, his world shrinking down to the 1,000th of an inch that separated a running engine from a solid block of scrap. His nights were lit by a single bare bulb hanging from the rafters. He would work until his knuckles were raw and his back felt like it was being compressed by a hydraulic press. There were moments, usually around 3 o'clock in the morning, when the silence of the barn felt like a physical weight, and he would wonder if Miller Vance was right. He would look at the disassembled transmission, the rotted wires, and the cratered radiator, and think about the 80 acres outside that were waiting for a plow. He was falling behind the planting schedule, his neighbors were already finishing their first pass, and he was still fighting 20 years of rust. But then he would find a small victory. He'd clear a mice nest from a cooling passage, or he'd finally hear the satisfying clack of a gear engaging for the first time since the Truman administration. He noticed that while the exterior was a ruin, the internal components, those protected by the mysterious, high-grade preservative he'd found earlier, were in remarkably good shape. Someone had intended for this machine to survive. Someone had put in the effort to seal the crankcase with waterproof compound, protecting the crankshaft and bearings from the very moisture that had destroyed everything else. This realization gave him a second wind. He wasn't just fixing a tractor, he was honoring a secret intent. As he moved into the second year of the restoration, the laughter in town didn't stop, but it changed in tone. It went from mocking to a strange, bewildered curiosity. People began to notice that the Thorne boy wasn't giving up. They saw the light in the barn burning at all hours, and they saw him hauling home scrap iron that somehow turned into working tools. Silas Thorne was becoming the county's laughingstock, but he was also becoming the most talented mechanic Lexington had seen in a generation, though he was too tired to realize it yet. The junk tractor was still a pile of parts, but for the first time in 2 decades, those parts were starting to remember how to be a machine. By the spring of 1972, Silas Thorne had aged a decade in 3 years. The isolation of the barn and the relentless pressure of the planting seasons had carved deep lines around his eyes, but his hands had stayed steady. He was no longer just a farmer. He was a man who had memorized every bolt, every gear, and every internal passage of the 1950 Formel M. It was during the final, meticulous cleaning of the engine block that the mystery of the $100 junk tractor finally began to unravel. Silas was hunched over the iron block with a high-intensity lamp and a fine wire brush, stripping away the last remnants of 20-year-old grime. As the metal began to gleam under the light, he noticed a faint outline stamped into the iron near the rear of the block, a series of numbers that didn't match any standard International Harvester designation he had seen in his manuals. He wiped the area with solvent and leaned in. The numbers were preceded by a small stamped X, a designation used in the 1950s for factory test mules. He sat back on his heels, his heart beginning to thrum against his ribs. A test mule was a machine that technically didn't exist in the public record. Back in 1951, International Harvester had been secretly developing the components that would eventually power the next generation of tractors, specifically the 706 series. To test these high-stress designs without alerting competitors, they had modified a small batch of standard 560 frames with prototype internal components. These machines were built with materials and tolerances that were far too expensive for mass production. Most of these experimental units were supposed to be scrapped once the data was collected, but Silas realized he was looking at a survivor, a machine that had somehow slipped through the cracks and ended up at a dealership in Nebraska 20 years ago. As he began to measure the internal components, the evidence became undeniable. The cylinders weren't standard, they were bored out significantly larger than a typical Formel M. The pistons he had been struggling to fit were different, heavier, crafted from a high-nickel alloy designed for extreme heat, and featuring a much higher compression ratio than any commercial engine of that era. The camshaft had a profile Silas didn't recognize, designed to keep valves open longer to breathe in more air. This wasn't a 60-horsepower engine, it was a factory-tuned monster capable of 90 or perhaps even 100 horsepower, disguised in the skin of a rusted utility tractor. The indestructible nature of the engine came from the fact that it was built for failure. Testing it was engineered to be pushed far beyond the limits of a normal machine. With this new understanding, Silas didn't just reassemble the engine, he tuned it to the specifications of the prototype. He spent another 2 months adjusting the timing and the fuel delivery, knowing now that the machine could handle pressures that would shatter a standard block. The neighbors still laughed when they saw the rusted brown hood through the barn doors, but Silas felt a quiet, internal fire. He knew he wasn't just fixing a tractor anymore, he was reviving a piece of engineering history that had been buried in the mud. The morning of the first true test was clear and cold. Silas had invited no one. He didn't want the mockery of Miller Vance or the pity of the local farmers if the machine failed. He climbed into the seat, which was still cracked and weathered, and placed his hand on the starter button. He set the choke, adjusted the throttle just as he had practiced 1,000 times in his mind, and pushed. The engine didn't just start, it erupted. It didn't have the smooth, polite rumble of the new John Deere tractors at the dealership. It had a deep, raw scream, a sound that was far too large for the frame it inhabited. Black smoke shot from the exhaust stack, clearing the starling's old nesting grounds in a single, powerful breath. As the oil began to circulate and the high alloy pistons found their rhythm, the sound smoothed out into a thunderous, rhythmic roar that made the very rafters of the barn vibrate. Silas sat there for a long time, the vibration traveling up through the seat and into his bones. Tears pricked at his eyes, but he didn't wipe them away. He put the tractor into gear, and for the first time in 20 years, the 1950 Farmall M moved under its own power. He drove it out of the barn and into the Nebraska sunshine. The tires were still mismatched, and the paint was still a ruin of brown and red. But as he reached the north field, he dropped the plow into the earth. A standard tractor of that size would have struggled with the heavy clay, the engine lugging down as the blades bit deep. But the test mule didn't even flinch. It pulled the 3-bottom plow through the earth as if it were cutting through warm butter. The torque was immense, a slow and steady application of force that seemed to ignore the resistance of the soil. Silas looked back at the furrow he was leaving. It was deep, straight, and perfect. In town, people heard the sound. They looked toward the Thorne farm, wondering what kind of engine could make such a noise. Miller Vance, standing on the lot of his dealership, heard the distant, metallic scream and felt a strange prickle of unease. He knew the sound of every modern machine he sold, and this wasn't one of them. It was a sound from a different era, one that had been built for work rather than speed, and it was currently tearing through the Thorne family's north field with a ferocity that defied explanation. Silas spent the rest of the day plowing. He didn't stop for lunch, and he didn't stop when the sun began to dip toward the horizon. He worked until the 80 acres were turned, the old Farmall M running cooler and steadier at the end of the day than it had at the beginning. He realized then that the secret wasn't just the alloy or the bored-out cylinders. The secret was that this machine didn't know how to quit. It had been designed by engineers who wanted to see how far iron could go, and Silas had been the one to give it a second chance to prove it. As he parked the tractor back in the barn that night, he patted the warm iron of the hood. The laughter in town didn't matter anymore. He had 90 horsepower of prototype steel under his seat, and he had a farm to save. The next 3 decades on the Thorne family land were a long lesson in stubbornness and the slow collapse of modern machinery myths. As the 1970s gave way to the volatile 1980s, the face of American agriculture changed in ways Silas Thorne never imagined. While his neighbors participated in what economists called the Great Expansion, borrowing millions of dollars to buy more land and the newest John Deere machines, Silas stayed loyal to the Farmall M that everyone had once called junk. He watched land prices skyrocket from $419 an acre to over $2,147 in just 10 years. The banks were practically begging farmers to borrow, and many believed the good times would never end. But Silas remembered his father, a man who had never borrowed a dime after paying off his original mortgage in 1950. He chose to live small, saving every penny and keeping his prototype engine running with mechanical intuition rather than a credit card. The farm crisis of the 1980s hit like a hammer. Interest rates climbed to 21.5%, turning operating loans into burdens that could not be carried. While corn and soybean prices fell through the floor, Silas stood on his 80 acres and watched his vintage Farmall M continue its labor. He didn't owe any man a cent, while around him, more than 300,000 American farms began to disappear. The men who had laughed at him at the 1970 auction were now facing foreclosure notices. Miller Vance, the arrogant dealer, no longer drove his truck out to mock Silas. His showroom, once full of shiny green iron, was half empty, and his dealership sign eventually went dark as sales plummeted and repossessions piled up. Silas remembered how Miller had called his tractor a tombstone, but it turned out that massive debt for modern machinery was the real tombstone for many in the county. By the 1990s, Silas Thorne's reputation had completely inverted. He was no longer the fool with a pile of rust. He was a legend in Dawson County. Mechanics at the big dealerships were often baffled by the complexities of modern hydraulics and onboard computers, but Silas, who had learned every inch of his test mule engine, could hear a faint knock and know exactly what needed adjusting. His Farmall M worked for 30 years without a single catastrophic failure. The secret was that it had no computers to override the operator, no sensors to tell it when to stop. It was built with raw pulling power and a steady torque, designed by engineers who wanted a machine that would pull until something broke, rather than a machine that would protect itself. Silas often told those who came to him for advice that modern equipment was built for speed, but the old ways were built for work. The contrast between Silas and the changing world became clearest when large-scale construction projects began to cut through the county. He watched contractors with $600,000 excavators sink into the bottomless black muck of the Nebraska swamps. Young engineers with advanced degrees would look at those stuck machines and claim nothing could move them. But Silas knew the problem wasn't horsepower, it was traction and patience. Time and again, Silas would drive his 90-horsepower prototype Farmall M to those sites. Using a system of chains and pulleys he had fabricated in his workshop, he did what the modern recovery winches could not. He never charged for the work, only asking for a donation to the local historical society to preserve the old ways. By 2005, Silas was 58 years old and his Farmall M was 55. It still wore its coat of rusty brown paint and the dents of decades of hard labor. But inside that engine block, the high-nickel alloy pistons and the special camshaft still operated as perfectly as the day he first fired them up in 1972. Silas had managed to buy 40 more acres from a neighbor facing bankruptcy, not to expand, but to save their family legacy. He applied the lessons of biology he had learned by watching how the earth responded to clover and manure, rather than the expensive chemicals the dealers always pushed. His farm was not the largest, but it was the most sustainable, an oasis of living soil in a land exhausted by debt and industrial farming. The mockers at the diner and the fairgrounds had grown old, and many had lost their land. When they drove past Silas's field and saw the rusted red and brown tractor still pulling deep furrows, they didn't laugh anymore. Instead, they stopped and stared at the machine that refused to become obsolete, wondering what they had missed in their race for the newest and shiniest things. Silas Thorne had proven that the old ways still worked best when the music stopped, and the true value of a man or a machine wasn't in the paint, but in the heart of the engine. By the year 2006, the legend of Silas Thorne and the $100 Farmall M had become a permanent fixture in the folklore of Dawson County. Silas was 59 years old now, his hair the color of Nebraska winter wheat, and his skin as weathered as the leather of his favorite work boots. He had lived through the high-octane expansion of the 70s, the heartbreaking foreclosures of the 80s, and the computerized revolution of the 90s. Through it all, the rusted brown tractor, the machine everyone had called a boat anchor, had never missed a single day of work. The final reckoning came on a sweltering July afternoon, not on Silas's farm, but at the site of a massive new irrigation project on the outskirts of Lexington. A large-scale commercial farming operation, owned by a group of investors from the city, had brought in a fleet of the most advanced machinery money could buy. At the center of their operation was a brand-new $600,000 articulated tractor, a beast of four-wheel drive power and satellite-guided precision. But as often happens in the Nebraska bottomlands, nature had a way of humbling even the most expensive engineering. A sudden, violent thunderstorm had turned the construction site into a sea of waist-deep black muck. The massive articulated tractor, despite its 1,000-horsepower engine and computerized traction control, had broken through the topsoil and sunk to its axles. The more the onboard computers tried to manage the torque, the deeper the machine dug itself into the abyss. By the time Silas arrived in his old Ford pickup, The modern marvel was buried so deep its cab looked like a yellow island in a lake of mud. Standing at the edge of the swamp was Miller Vance's grandson, a young man named Corey, who had inherited the family dealership, but none of his grandfather's mechanical intuition. Corey was surrounded by engineers with laptops, trying to diagnose why the hydraulic systems were refusing to engage. They had tried 2 bulldozers and a heavy recovery winch, but every time they applied power, the modern machines simply sensed the overload and backed off, their sensors protecting them from the very work they were built to do. "It's impossible," Corey shouted, his face red with frustration. "The software says the resistance is beyond the safety rating of the transmission. If we pull any harder, we'll shatter the drivetrain." Silas stepped out of his truck, the sound of his boots on the gravel, the only steady thing in the chaos. He looked at the buried machine, then at the desperate young man. "You don't need a software update, Corey," Silas said quietly. "You need a machine that doesn't know when to give up." Corey looked at Silas with a mixture of disbelief and the remnants of the old Vance pride. "And I suppose you think that antique piece of junk sitting in your barn is the answer. Silas, that tractor is 56 years old. My grandfather laughed at it when you bought it, and honestly, I should do the same." "Your grandfather was a man who measured worth by a price tag," Silas replied, his voice calm as a still pond. "But iron doesn't care about price tags. It only cares about how it was forged." An hour later, the rhythmic, thunderous roar of the Farmall M echoed across the valley. The townspeople had gathered at the fence line, just as they had 36 years earlier at the fairgrounds. They watched as the rusted, brown tractor crested the rise, trailing the same black smoke that had signaled its rebirth in 1972. Silas had attached the heavy steel chains, the ones with links as thick as a man's wrist, directly to the frame of the test mule. He positioned the Farmall on a patch of ground he knew was supported by a limestone shelf 4 feet down. He didn't use a computer. He used the vibration of the seat to tell him where the earth was solid. He signaled the crew to stand back. As Silas opened the throttle, the $100 secret was finally revealed to the entire county. The engine didn't lug down. It didn't stutter. The high-nickel alloy pistons and the prototype camshaft, those parts designed for the test mule designation, delivered a steady, terrifying application of torque that no commercial machine was ever meant to possess. The drive wheels, studded with steel cleats Silas had fabricated himself, bit into the ground like teeth. The chain went taut as a piano wire, humming with tension that should have snapped any standard tractor in half. For a long moment, the world seemed to stand still. Then, with a sound like a thunderclap underground, the suction of the mud broke. The $600,000 articulated tractor began to move. Inch by inch, the modern giant was dragged out of its grave by the rusted ghost of 1950. When the machine was finally on solid ground, Silas shut down the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. The engineers stared at their laptops, which were still reporting that the feat Silas had just accomplished was mathematically impossible. Corey Vance stood with his mouth open, looking from the glistening, mud-covered giant to the small, vibrating red and brown tractor that had rescued it. "How?" Corey whispered, stepping toward the Farmall. "How did that engine not shatter?" Silas climbed down from the seat, his joints creaking, and wiped a smudge of oil from the hood. "Because this isn't just a tractor, Corey. This was an International Harvester test mule. When they built this block in 1950, they weren't trying to make a profit. They were trying to see how much power iron could hold before it died." He pointed to the faint X designation stamped into the iron. "They used materials you can't buy anymore. But more than that, it's been maintained by a man who knows that expensive doesn't mean better, and new doesn't mean smarter." In the weeks that followed, the line of trucks outside Silas Thorne's workshop didn't consist of neighbors looking for a cheap fix. It was a line of the most successful contractors and farmers in the state, men who had finally realized that their high-tech fleets were missing the very things Silas had found in a scrapyard: reliability and the human touch. They didn't just want him to fix their machines, they wanted him to teach them how to think like him. Silas took on a few students, mostly young kids, who were tired of being told that they were just operators of computers. He taught them about mechanical advantage, about the difference between horsepower and torque, and about the stubbornness of iron. He told them the story of the 1970 auction every single day, reminding them that the world will always tell you something is worthless if it isn't shiny and new. On his 78th birthday, Silas walked out to the barn. The Farmall M was still there, parked in the same spot where he had first winched it off a trailer 38 years before. He hadn't sold it. even when collectors offered him $12,500, a sum that made his $100 investment look like a miracle. The hidden compartment in the crankcase was empty now, the money and the deed long since used to help other families keep their land during the hard years. He realized that the true secret in the engine block wasn't the hidden money or the high-strength alloy. The secret was the grit it took to see value where everyone else saw junk. Silas sat on the porch of the house his grandfather had built, looking out over 80 acres of dark, rich soil that was now debt-free and thriving. He heard the distant whistle of a steam engine from the neighbor's farm and smiled. The world would keep moving faster, the machines would keep getting more complex, and people would keep forgetting the lessons of the past. But somewhere in Nebraska, there would always be a shed behind a barn where an old machine sat waiting, ready to prove that the old ways still work when nothing else does. Silas Thorne had paid $100 for a piece of iron, and in return, it had given him a life of meaning, a reputation that would outlast the rust, and a secret that would never truly be silent.